The full-scale war in Ukraine has become relatively unexpected for the whole world, although many people spoke of such plans. Western politicians talked about it a couple of months before the attack. Of course, the war was started by Russia, and it's the Russian side that bears full responsibility for what is happening now. At the same time, the West made many mistakes and made this war possible. And in this video we will talk about the mistakes of the Western countries which increase the likelihood of this war in Ukraine. So the first question is the expansion of NATO to the east, which is often talked about in Russia and even by Putin. There is a myth among the Russian establishment that the United States made a promise to Gorbachev not to expand NATO to the east. However, the problem is that no one can definitely confirm this promise. There are simply no agreements of this kind, and in the oral retelling Gorbachev was confused, talking about the expansion of NATO on East Germany, or he said that there were no such promises at all. And in general, NATO is a separate alliance, and the promise, as Putin says, was given by the American president. It's not fully clear what the legislative basis was for such promises. Inside NATO, any decisions are made by all the countries of the bloc. The President of the United States should have approved such a thing in Congress. Generally, there were no promises. However, the policy of NATO expansion to the east was probably short-sighted. It was especially short-sighted to include Eastern European countries in NATO and ignore Russia on this score. Russia in the 90s was quite positive towards the West and sought to integrate into Western institutions. Despite the fact that the President of the United States and Russia met regularly and established cooperation, Russia never joined NATO and the European Union. It's not completely clear why Russia did not join NATO in the end, because even during Putin's first term, such a possibility was discussed. Anyway, Russia was not fully integrated with Western institutions, which is why it began to antagonize itself to them. The second question continues the theme of integration into Western institutions and economic reforms. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, serious transformational reforms of the economy began in Russia, and the ordinary population faced huge problems. Western countries, although they supported the reforms, and even provided humanitarian assistance, did not contribute to the implementation of reforms and did not give finance for their conduct. As a result, it turned out that many people were on the verge of existence, and the majority of the population, due to the harsh experience of the 90s, began to reject the ideas of democracy and liberalism, and sentiment for the Soviet past began to grow. Of course, the West owed nothing to Russia, but many Western politicians even then offered to provide Russia and other post-Soviet countries with some kind of analog of the Marshall Plan, so that countries could better adjust to market rails. In total, Western countries missed opportunities in the 90s to include Russia in their institutions with its integration into the Western political space. Russia at that time was ready for such changes. However, since this did not happen, Russia began to oppose the West again, and revenge sentiments began to prevail. The third issue, which was also resolved in the 90s, is the issue of denuclearization of Ukraine and give it guarantees which are enshrined in the Budapest Memorandum. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, four nuclear powers appeared on the world map instead of one, namely Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The countries received nuclear weapons as a Soviet legacy, but already in the 90s, Western countries insisted that instead of four countries, only Russia remained as a nuclear country. Thus, the so-called Budapest Memorandum was signed in 1994, according to which Ukraine renounced its nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees of its territorial integrity. The memorandum was signed by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. After 20 years, it turned out that this memorandum has no force, and one of the guarantors of territorial integrity is annexing Crimea and is going to do it with other Ukrainian territories. The exchange of nuclear weapons for guarantees of territorial integrity turned out to be no sense. The fourth issue is the pacification of Russia. The war in Ukraine is far from the first aggressive actions on the part of Russia towards other peoples and countries. However, Western countries have long ignored this state of affairs and tried to appease Russia. So the West particularly turned a blind eye to what happened during the Chechen wars, and there were mass massacres of civilians and the destruction of entire cities. The war with Georgia in 2008 was also perceived coolly by the West. Moreover, after the settlement of the conflict between Russia and the United States, the tension in the relationship began to go away. In 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass, although condemned by Western countries, but their action was rather weak, and relations with Russia were continued. The fifth issue should be considered separately. This is the annexation of Crimea. As already mentioned, Western countries reacted to the annexation and even imposed a number of sanctions against Russia. Nevertheless, even after the act of annexation, they continued to do business with Russia, and economic cooperation only increased. Since the beginning of the war in 2022, Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister, noted that the West's insufficient reaction to the annexation of Crimea was his main mistake, which allowed today's war. The annexation of Crimea has become an extremely negative precedent for the European continent. Since the Second World War, no European country has torn away part of another territory and annexed it to itself. Other separatist conflicts ended with the separation of regions, but not their annexation to other countries. In this sense, the Crimean scenario turned out to be unique and incredibly dangerous, as it violates the current state of affairs and the world stage. However, European leaders practically ignored it, believing that since the annexation took place without military involvement, then it's okay. However, it was the annexation of Crimea that legitimized Putin's further actions, and he is already ready to annex other lands to Russia. The sixth issue is economic dependence on Russia. Despite what happened in Crimea, Western leaders were not bothered by this, and in general, despite minor sanctions, they continued to conduct relations with Russia. Moreover, Germany only increased imports of Russian gas over the past 8 years, which is why it has essentially become economically dependent on Russia, and the Russian government had the opportunity to blackmail many Western countries. And some of the economic sanctions that were imposed then were bypassed by the Russian authorities. In particular, the Western equipment was noticed on Russian tanks that invaded Ukraine. Such a short-sighted policy firstly allowed the Kremlin to redirect money from the resources sold to increase and modernize the army. Secondly, it has made Europe dependent on Russia. So if Russia cuts off gas tomorrow or a significant part, for example, the German chemical industry will not be able to work. Thirdly, they made it clear to Putin that no matter what, Europe is ready to cooperate and trade with Russia. This state of affairs has further untied Putin's hands and then played a serious role in blackmail against Western countries. In general, it's worth noting that Western countries have long ignored the fact that Putin has been in power for more than 20 years, that authoritarian power has been established in Russia, and that human rights are being violated, the opposition is being eliminated, and the media are being closed, and so on. It was the establishment of strict regime inside Russia that allowed Putin to unleash a war against another country. Otherwise, Putin simply could not have done it. However, the West turned a blind eye to what was happening in Russia and continued to conduct relations with Putin. In general, there was an opinion in post-war Europe that if there is close economic cooperation between the countries, then it will be possible to avoid major conflicts in Europe. It really worked with the European Union, but after the establishment of dictatorships, such security guarantees stopped working, since society cannot provide influence on the government. It's worth mentioning the mistakes that the West made just before the conflicts began. The first is the transfer of weapons to Ukraine, or rather the insufficient armament of Ukraine at the beginning of the conflict. In general, Western countries did not expect that Ukraine would be able to hold out significantly and predicted its fall in a few days, because they feared that the transferred weapons would simply end up in the hands of Russia. The second mistake is the preventive sanctions that Zelensky asked for. The introduction of such sanctions would have hit Russia more significantly and perhaps could have influenced the decision to start a war. Summing up, it's worth saying that the West has made quite a lot of mistakes that have affected what is happening in Ukraine. Among them are the refusal to help Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, not including Russia in Western institutions, taking nuclear weapons from Ukraine, appeasing Russia and ignoring previous wars, and in the end, building close economic relations with the Kremlin.